Please welcome our keynote speaker, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, Marc Mauer.
Let me just start with my thanks to the students who put this together. This is a wonderful idea. And also to all of you who have been involved in doing tutoring in the prisons. It's always seemed to me, in addition to the value of the work itself and the needs inside prison, every time we go into prisons, speaking for myself, I always learn a lot. And I think if we could have every American spend a day in prison talking to prisoners, talking to guards, looking at what goes on, I think we'd have a very different national conversation about issues of crime and punishment, very different than what we've been doing for the last several decades or so. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is what I have called the race to incarcerate of the last 4 decades or so. So to take a look at what that's meant, what the prison explosion has been about, how did it come about, what do we know about its consequences, and where does that leave us today in terms of thinking about reform, thinking about a different approach to these issues of crime and punishment. And in order to understand where we are today, let's go back to 1972, the year that the prison population started to rise. Richard Nixon was president, and let's imagine that President Nixon comes on television to make a speech to the American people, and here's what he says. He says, "My fellow Americans, we have a problem of crime in this country, but I have a plan for dealing with it. Here's my plan. First, I'm going to build 1 million new prison cells and fill them as quickly as possible. Second, because we know that crime takes place in minority communities, I'm going to reserve 60% of those prison cells for blacks and Latinos. And third, I'm going to put 3,000 people on death row and start to execute them as quickly as possible. That's my plan for dealing with crime." Now, what would have been the reaction to such a plan? Well, I think there would have been great outrage by civil rights organizations, civil liberties groups. I think we would have had editorials in leading newspapers decrying this barbaric plan for dealing with a fundamental social problem. I think it would have been just an unbelievably awful moment that a president of the United States could come this far. Well, President Nixon never made such a speech, but this is precisely what our criminal justice policies have produced over the last 4 decades. Let me show you what this looks like. This is a graph of prison population in the United States for about a 50-year period, 1925 to 1972. These are the number of people in state and federal prisons. What you can see here is a relatively straight line. The number of people in prison goes up somewhat in the Depression years, goes down somewhat during World War II, but no dramatic shifts. And we end 1972 with about 200,000 people in our prison system. Here's what comes next. Over the last 40 years, that race to incarcerate, that explosion that no one did predict at the time, and indeed we have added more than 1 million people to our prison system. If you count local jails as well, we have about 2.2 million people behind bars in the United States. Just, an incredible dramatic shift in that period of time. To put some perspective on that, this is a comparison of the incarceration rates around the world, a selection of countries. In other words, the percentage of a population behind bars measured per 100,000. And the United States has come to lead the world in its use of incarceration, its rate of incarceration. Our old Cold War rival Russia is not too far behind. Rwanda was in very special circumstances, is quite high as well. But if you compare the U.S. to other industrialized nations, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 8 times the rate of those other nations. And regardless of what you think about the causes of this situation, it seems to me there's something fundamentally jarring that the world's wealthiest society, a society that prides itself on its democratic traditions, somehow has come to be the world's most punitive nation when we look at the use of imprisonment. There's something going on here that doesn't make a lot of sense. Finally, we know that incarceration doesn't cut across the population equally. It's very much skewed in certain directions, certainly categorized by race and ethnicity. This is research from the Justice Department that tells us the odds of going to prison. This is for males born in 2001. And if current trends continue, 1 of every 3 black males can expect to spend time in prison in his lifetime, 1 of every 6 Latino males, and 1 of every 17 white males. The figures for women are lower overall, but we see similar racial ethnic disparities there as well. So this is what the race to incarcerate has brought us: an explosion in the prison population. We've become a world leader, enormous racial ethnic disparities in how we use incarceration. So the question, of course, is how did we get here? What has been going on for the last 40 years that would explain that? Some people would suggest, well, we have about 7 times as many people behind bars. We might have 7 times as much crime now, and that would explain why so many people are in prison. If we go back to the early years, crime rates were rising from about the mid-60s to the mid-70s. That was a time when we saw the rise of the baby boom generation, and all things being equal, if you had more young men in the age group 15 to 24 or so, that's often associated with greater involvement in crime. We had increasing urbanization at the time is another factor that's often associated. So a number of things were happening, crime rates were going up, and that explains at least part of that initial rise in the prison population in the 1970s. But since about 1980, and the best research we have shows us that the changes in the prison population are a result of changes in policy, not crime rates. So essentially, policy choices around sentencing, where legislative bodies at the national and the state level have enacted policies designed to send more people to prison and to keep them there for longer periods of time. So what does this look like? Well, it's a whole range of policies under the rubric of get tough on crime and the like. It's mandatory sentencing, it's 3 strikes and you're out, it's truth in sentencing, and a host of other restrictive policies that have been enacted all across the country. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how this is played out. You may know in California is one of about 25 states that have some type of 3 strikes and you're out policy. Basically, in your 3rd serious crime, you can get a life sentence. This is usually what these laws call for. California's law was enacted in a far broader way than any other state. In California, your first 2 strikes had to be violent or serious as defined in the code, but your 3rd strike could be any felony in the state. So the California law was challenged. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the question was, did it represent cruel and unusual punishment? The 2 cases that went to the court, in the first one, the man's 3rd strike involved stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He went in the store, had some baggy pants, stuck the golf clubs in pants, walked out, was immediately apprehended. The second case involved a man who stole $153 worth of videotape from a Kmart store on 2 separate occasions. So the court had to decide, did their sentences constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and they rejected the argument, and their decision basically said, if this is what the legislators of California believe is necessary to fight crime, we don't want to second guess their judgment on that, and that's for them to determine. So the golf club thief had a sentence of 25 to life, and the videotape thief is serving 50 to life in California prisons. This is what these laws can produce. I should say one small note of hope on this. In 2012, because of cases like this, it was a ballot proposal in California which the public endorsed restrictions on third strikes like these. So the third strikes still now need to be serious or violent, and people sentenced under these previous crimes can appeal to have their sentence reduced. But nonetheless, thousands of people were sent to prison under this and will continue to be even under the revised law. Another case, this in the town of Tyler, Texas, some years ago. A man was charged with stealing a candy bar from a convenience store. He walked out of the store with a candy bar. Now, I'm sure none of you know anybody who's ever stolen a candy bar or something like that from the store. This is a very serious crime, you know. Now, what happens when you steal a candy bar? Well, depending on the circumstances, you might have to give the candy bar back or pay for it. If you go to court, maybe you'll have to do some community service for what you've done, apologize for, things like that. But in this case, the young man was charged with a felony offense. Prosecutors have the authority, if it's larceny from a building, taking something without permission, things like that, it technically can be considered a felony. So he was charged with a felony. He also had a number of prior convictions. Most of these were for minor property, minor assault charges. At least on one occasion, he had stolen a bag of cookies from a convenience store, so he sort of has a sweet tooth that's getting him into trouble here and all. Because he had these priors, the prosecutor also charged him with being a habitual offender. This is laws that most states have that will increase the sentence based on your prior record. So he's charged with a felony, he's charged with being a habitual offender, he goes to court, he's convicted in court, and sentenced to 16 years in prison for stealing a candy bar. The only thing more bizarre than that was the prosecutor was asked by a reporter on the way out of the courtroom if she thought maybe this was a little excessive for stealing a candy bar, and her response was, well, it was a king-size candy bar. You couldn't make this up, right? Now, I don't mean to suggest that most of the people in prison are there for stealing videotapes and candy bars. There are many people in prison who have committed very serious crimes that have hurt people, that have been a very serious problem for their communities. But if we look at the prison system overall, how prison is used, I think in many ways the story is even much more disturbing than this. Today, of the people in prison, about half of them are serving a current sentence for a nonviolent property or drug offense. If we look at who these people are and their backgrounds, about 3/4 of them have a history of substance abuse. 1 of every 6 has a history of mental illness. If we look at women in prison, more than half of them have been victims of physical or sexual abuse. We could go on with a whole series of sort of fundamental failings of institutions to deal with these problems, to provide opportunity for people and the like. None of this excuses people's behavior or the crimes they may have committed, but it certainly helps us understand some of the reasons why we've seen all these people end up in prison, primarily from low-income, disadvantaged communities. And the major policy decision that's affected this, of course, in the last several decades has been the war on drugs, which began in the 1980s. Just to give a feel for what that's looked like, in 1980, we had about 40,000 people in prison or jail serving a drug sentence or awaiting trial for a drug sentence. 40,000 people. Today, that figure is about 500,000 people, 500,000 people behind bars for a drug offense. And to put some perspective on that, there are more people behind bars today than the entire prison and jail population back in 1980. That's something about the range of what's happened. About 2/3 of the people behind bars for a drug offense are African American or Latino. which ties in very much with, I think, what the drug war has been all about. We say that there's a war on drugs. I think there's really a two-tiered war on drugs. When we look at communities with resources, when parents in these communities find out that their teenage son or daughter has a drug problem, they don't generally call up the police chief and demand that their kid be arrested and sentenced to prison under a mandatory prison term. Instead, they call up their friends who are social workers and they try to find the best treatment program they can come up with, and they throw money at problems, as we like to say, because they think that's a better approach. In low-income communities where we don't have those same resources available, the problem becomes more defined as a criminal justice problem. And then we don't throw money in the form of treatment, but we have police and prosecutors and prisons to respond to that also. The racial dynamics of the war on drugs, while theoretically race neutral on the surface, have played out in very dramatic, disparate ways. The most sort of obvious one, the sort of federal crack cocaine penalties. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, where Congress, responding to this new drug, crack cocaine, in the mid-1980s, passed very severe laws punishing crack cocaine offenses far more so than powder cocaine offenses, even though pharmacologically these are two forms of the same drug. It turned out, as probably could have been predicted, about 80% of the people prosecuted for a crack offense were African American. For powder cocaine, it's far more likely to be whites or Latinos. And this is not a problem that just developed in the 1980s. If you go back 100 years in the various wars on drugs that we've had, we see these same patterns playing out over and over again. Think about the history of marijuana policy in this country. In the 1930s, marijuana was viewed as a drug that was used by people in the sort of seedy parts of town, nightclubs, jazz clubs. Basically, the imagery was these were black neighborhoods, Mexican-American neighborhoods, and the like. Whether or not this was correct, that was the popular image of where and who was using marijuana. And this was also the time of marijuana as a sort of demon drug and reefer madness days and all that sort of thing. 30 years later, along come the 1960s, and all of a sudden, millions of mostly white middle-class college students start consuming huge amounts of marijuana. And what we saw is that public attitude towards marijuana changed almost overnight. All of a sudden, marijuana became celebrated in popular culture. There are calls for decriminalization or legalization. Marijuana was viewed as a fun thing to do by large portions of the population. Now, nothing had changed about the drug itself. The only thing that had changed was the perception of the users of the drug. And once we had a different public image of who was using the drugs, all of a sudden attitudes changed very dramatically. So it tells us something about how are we making policy decisions, how do societies come to what kinds of values are behind, what kinds of perceptions are behind policies that we, again, often call race neutral on the surface. So we have this prison explosion, we have tough sentencing, we have the war on drugs, a whole set of factors going into this. There are people who support these developments who would make the argument that, well, we needed to employ all these policies because we have a crime problem. The purpose of this is to reduce crime, and yes, it took putting 2 million people behind bars to do that, but that's the price we have to pay, and if people didn't want to be behind bars, they shouldn't commit crime. That's essentially the argument there. So what do we know about the effect of prison on crime? Well, if we look at the early mid-90s, since that time, crime has gone down pretty substantially in the United States, roughly 30-40%, depending on how you measure it and where you look and the like. And this is at a time when the prison population has generally been going up. And so some people make the very simple connection there: more people in prison, less crime. That kind of proves the point. Well, it's not quite that simple. If you look at the immediate period just before that, the mid to late 1980s, the prison population was also going up then, and also actually going up quite dramatically then, and yet crime was increasing along with prison increasing. So we go back over 30 or 40 years, prison populations have gone up almost every single year. Crime rates have gone up, crime rates have gone down. There is a relationship, but it's hardly a consistent relationship where every time we put people in prison, we can be sure the crime rate will go down. Now, the research to date has looked at these dynamics and basically asked, what do we know about this relationship? The more optimistic pieces suggest that maybe 25% of the decline in violent crime during this period was due to putting more people in prison. Other very good studies say it's as little as 10% of the decline was due to more people in prison. But let's look at the optimistic one, 25%. Is this good news or bad news? Well, 25% of declining crime is not trivial and means that there are far fewer victims as a result of putting more people in prison. But it also tells us that 3/4 of the decline in crime had nothing to do with putting more people in prison. There were other things going on. So what else was going on in that period? Well, part of it was changes in drug use and the drug trade. You know, we had the crack cocaine epidemic of the late 80s, early 90s, and as has been true for other drug epidemics, they often seem very terrible while they're happening, but they don't last forever, typically 3 to 5 years with a new drug like crack cocaine. So as crack use and the crack trade started to decline and the violence associated with that trade, crime rate did come down quite a bit because of that. In some cities, the police got smarter about how they did policing and more strategic and employing more community policing sorts of methods, and that seems to have been an element as well. During the 90s, we had a relatively healthy economy in many areas, and so people either coming out of prison or people who might have otherwise been getting involved in criminal activities may have had opportunities for at least low-wage jobs, other kinds of changes going on in communities' behavior. So a number of things coming together to produce this other sort of 75% or more of the decline in crime. Now, in some ways, this seems a little counterintuitive because regardless of what you think about prison, if we had such an explosion in the prison population, you might imagine that we would have had even a more significant effect on reducing crime with a world record prison population. There are a number of reasons why this effect has been limited, but let me just tell you one in particular, and that has to do with who's incarcerated in prison. Imagine two offenders who we send to prison. Offender A is a serial rapist who's been terrorizing a neighborhood. The police finally catch him, he's brought to court, he's convicted, he's sent to prison. So in this case, we've sent one person to prison, but we brought some measure of public safety to that particular neighborhood. Offender B is a kid on the street corner who's selling drugs. The cops come by on Saturday night, they do a drug sweep, they see him selling drugs, he's brought to court, convicted. He's sentenced to prison on one of these mandatory prison sentences, and he goes away for 5 years for selling drugs. So in this case also, we're sending one person to prison. How much effect do we have on crime in this case? Well, if we go back to that street corner where he was selling drugs, how long do you imagine it's going to take before somebody else steps up on that street corner to try to meet the demand for drugs in that neighborhood? I think it's going to take about 20 minutes in most neighborhoods. As long as we have a demand, there's almost an endless number of young men, increasingly young women, who are stepping up in the belief that they can make a little bit of money doing this. So in this case, just like with the serial rapist, we've increased the prison population by one person, but it's not at all clear that we've had any effect on the problem for which this person was arrested. But we have done something else as well. Prison today costs conservatively about $25,000 a year to keep a person behind bars. So we've just made a decision, locking this young man out for 5 years, we made a decision to spend $125,000 to keep him locked up for 5 years because we're trying to do something about the drug problem. Now imagine we go to that street corner, imagine I'm the mayor of this town and we have a community meeting and I say to people in the community, I'm going to give you $125,000 to deal with the drug problem in your neighborhood. You need to decide how you want to spend that money, and let's get together and talk about it. Now, what would they come up with? Well, I think some people would probably suggest, let's have a cop standing on the corner 24/7 to deter people from selling drugs there. Other people would say we need more treatment programs. Some people would want summer jobs for their kids. There are a lot of ideas we could come up with for how to respond to the problems in that neighborhood. It's hard to imagine there's any community in the country where they would say, let's spend every penny locking up one person in prison for 5 years and then tell ourselves that we've dealt with this problem here, right? It would make no sense whatsoever. And yet, day after day after day for the last 25 years, that's essentially what we've been doing through the war on drugs. As lower level people in the drug trade are sent to prison by the tens of thousands, the effect on the drug trade, the effect on drug problems is very modest, coming at great expense and coming at the expense of trying to intervene in some other kinds of ways. The other thing we know about public safety, even to the extent that we may think that putting more people in prison has reduced crime by 25% or something like that, or of the decline. This doesn't tell us whether that's the most effective, let alone compassionate way to deal with the problem. If we want to answer that question, then what we need to look at is if we want to spend $1 million to promote public safety, how much public safety can we buy by building prisons? How much could we buy through Head Start programs? How much could we buy through drug treatment? I won't go through all the research, but there's very good research that shows us that a variety of social interventions are much more cost-effective in reducing crime than expanding a prison system that's already at world record levels. So we have to talk, it's not a question of prison or nothing, it's we are going to spend money on public safety, how much goes to prison and how much goes to other kinds of interventions. I think we're very much out of balance. So we know something about the degree to which prison may have an effect on public safety, and this is often the argument that we hear, but we need to go beyond that too. I think when we have mass incarceration, the ripple effects go well beyond that initial question of how much crime is reduced. We have to ask about what other kinds of impacts are there. For a start, there are the families of people sent off to prison. The day that a person is sentenced in the courtroom, he or she has a spouse or a partner or kids, most likely, who are also affected by incarceration. Today, there's something like 1.7 million children who have a parent behind bars on any given day. Because of the racial disparities in incarceration for Black children, these figures about 1 of every 14 has a parent behind bars on any given day. So the effects of these children growing up, first with the loss of financial, psychological support of a parent, second with the stigma that goes along of having a parent behind bars, this is not a very healthy situation for these kids to be growing up in. We see as well how high rates of incarceration can destabilize not only families but entire communities. A colleague who's done research in Washington, D.C., has looked at high incarceration neighborhoods, in other words, ones that have the most people going off to prison. And he looks at the gender ratios in those neighborhoods, and he finds that there are 62 adult men for every 100 adult women in these neighborhoods. Now, where are the missing men? Well, some of them are in the military, some have died, but many of them are behind bars. So if we think about what does this mean in terms of marriage, parenting, opportunities, just cohesion in the community, mass incarceration is really tearing away at all those institutions that we all like to think are important in terms of raising children, developing healthy systems in which they can grow up in. We see mass incarceration affecting a whole range of community dynamics, not the least of which is what does it mean for our democracy? When you get convicted of a felony, in almost every state, you lose your right to vote for some period of time. These laws don't grow out of recent decades. In some ways, they go back to the time of the founding of this country. This country was founded as an experiment in democracy, which it certainly was, but it was obviously a very limited experiment. So a group of wealthy white male property holders granted themselves the right to vote. So women couldn't vote, African Americans, illiterates, poor people, and also people with a felony conviction. Over the course of 200 years, we've done away with all those other prohibitions, and the sole remaining group that is left out of the voting booth are people with felony convictions. Today, in 48 states, you can't vote while you're in prison. In 35 of those states, you also can't vote if you're on probation or parole. In 12 of those states, you may even lose the right to vote after you complete your sentence, and sometimes for the rest of your life. So nearly 6 million people are not eligible to vote today because of a current or prior felony conviction. If we think about the sort of impact of this, I think it's very important in terms of democracy and how we think about inclusion, but at this scale, it's very likely to be affecting real-world electoral outcomes as well. The most obvious being the 2000 presidential election, the historic election, determined by 537 votes in the state of Florida. On the day of the election, Florida is one of the 4 most restrictive states in the country. On that day, there were an estimated 600,000 ex-felons, people who completed their sentence yet still were disenfranchised under Florida law, who could not participate in the election. Now, had Florida been less restrictive, how many of those would have voted? Who would they have voted for? We can only speculate about that, but clearly we may have decided a national election based on the restrictive disenfranchisement laws of this one state. It's also the case, as is true of our criminal justice policies broadly, if you look at world standards and comparisons, the United States is all by itself among democratic nations. We lead the world in incarceration. We're one of just a handful of democratic nations that still employ the death penalty. And when it comes to disenfranchisement, there's no other country, a democratic nation, would ever consider disenfranchising ex-felons. Many countries in Western Europe or Canada allow everyone to vote, including people in prison. So we are a very extreme outlier on this area. Well, that's a sort of grim picture I painted, and unfortunately I think it's very accurate. But I also think there's reason for hope, reason for looking at how the climate has been changing over the last decade or so. How do we move on from here to try to shift public policy in both a more effective and a more compassionate direction? Let me just tell you 2 quick incidents that give a flavor of what this shift looks like, I think. About 4 years ago or so, I received a dinner invitation. The invitation was from a guy named Newt Gingrich, who you may have heard of. And the letter said he's very concerned about the number of people in prison and what our prison system is doing to people, and he wanted to bring together a small group for dinner and talk about these issues and what we could do about it. So I don't know about you, but I don't get invited to dinner by Newt Gingrich every day of the week, so I thought it'd be good to go. So I go to the dinner, and there's maybe 24 people there, and in addition to Gingrich, it was high-ranking right-wing people in the United States. Grover Norquist was there, Michael Steele, at the time was the head of the Republican National Committee, was there, a number of the leading lights like that. And over a 3-hour or so dinner, we had a very free-flowing discussion about drug policy, about prison, about alternatives, about federal and local issues and the like. We didn't agree about everything. We didn't come from the same perspective, but it was very surprising how much area of consensus there was, particularly when it came to incarceration of drug offenders, particularly when it came to the federal role in the war on drugs and the like. So very intriguing developments. They've now gone on to form an organization called Right on Crime, sort of a double meaning, but it's sort of prominent right-wing figures who are making a call for reducing the prison population, getting many low-level drug offenders out of prison, and the like. The second incident, this goes back to last summer. Attorney General Eric Holder makes a high-profile speech at the American Bar Association conference, and it's about mass incarceration. And he says, we are sending too many people to too many prisons for far too long. Too many people, too many prisons. This is the Attorney General of the United States. And what was almost as remarkable about the speech was the reaction. In the old days, you would assume he would be attacked for being soft on crime and a Democratic politician and the like. There was hardly a hint of anything like that. If anything, he was praised by all sorts of people. There was lots of discussion about what the implications are, what can we do about this. Really important moment, I think. And I think as much as the Attorney General deserves credit for getting these issues out there, I think it's also a recognition that the political climate had shifted enough that he could feel comfortable making such a speech knowing that there would be a positive response. We at the Sentencing Project and many of our colleagues are very much engaged now in trying to work for sentencing reform, changing policy and legislation. As we speak, over the last couple of months in Congress, the Senate Judiciary has passed 2 very substantial bills to significantly reform mandatory sentencing laws in particular. They would cut the length of mandatory prison terms in half. They would make sentencing reforms for crack cocaine offenders retroactive, people in prison. They would grant judges more discretion in sentencing, a number of other things as well. These have been passed on bipartisan votes in Senate Judiciary Committee, and the leadership on these, on the Democratic side, it's been primarily Senators Durbin and Leahy, longtime liberal leaders in the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, it's Rand Paul, Mike Lee, who's a Tea Party guy from Utah, and Ted Cruz are among the leadership there, coming together with Senators Durbin and Leahy. There's something going on here or so. So from both sides, again, we're seeing a commonality in goals, maybe not always coming from the same direction with the same motivations, but a surprising amount of overlap coming together around this. So things are starting to change. If we look at where the prison system is at now, after nearly 4 decades, the prison population is finally starting to decline the last 3 years or so, not by a lot, 1 or 2% a year, but given 40 years of different history, significant. There are 3 states, New Jersey, New York, California, where the prison population has actually gone down by 25% over the last decade or so with no adverse effect on public safety. So we're starting to see things change. We're starting to see we could do things differently. There's a movement around prison reentry. What do we do with people coming home from prison to reduce the prospects that they may be going back? So let me close with just one image of how we may want to think about this. There was a time in the sort of mid-90s when there was a small group of high-profile academics and commentators, I won't list them by name, who came up with this term of super predators. They were talking about these super predators and predictions that the young people growing up at the time would be wilder and more crime-prone and more out of control than any generation of young people we'd ever seen. And they had op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal and other publications and the like warning us of this coming crime wave. Got a lot of attention. Their social science prediction abilities were not very good because not very long after they made these predictions, crime rates started to decline, even more so for juveniles and even more so for kids of color. And it's quite clear they were talking about kids of color in their predictions. So they didn't really know what they were talking about, but they got a lot of attention. But suppose for a moment we had some social science research that told us that we have a group of 5-year-old boys, and a decade from now we could anticipate they would be high-rate offenders, and we better think about what we're going to do about that. How would we respond if we had that information available? Well, it seems to me there are two choices. One is we could start to build prisons as quickly as possible to make sure we have enough places to put them behind bars by the time they turn 15 or 16. That's one way we could go. The second approach would be to say, the good news is we have a 10-year window of opportunity now. What can we do with their families, with their communities, in their schools, in their community institutions? What can we do to try to reduce the prospects that at least some of them will become involved as high-rate offenders or so? And 10 years is a long time, so what would we do? Well, if they were your kids and my kids, the answer would be pretty obvious what we would do, what kinds of interventions we would favor. When they're viewed as other people's kids in other communities, then we get a very different approach, a very punitive approach, and the one that's characterized the last several decades. So I think our job in part and fundamentally is how do we develop public policy and practice that treats other people's kids as if they were our kids. And if we take that as a model, I think we end up with very different kinds of outcomes. So let me close again and just say how terrific it is, particularly for the students organizing this, all the work you're doing. I think this is a moment that we can really achieve some change. We are very optimistic about the prospects. So I think the challenge is how do we go forward from here. Thanks so much and look forward to working with you.